Hello everyone, this is a short video to explain my artifact ontology page created by Prodigy. Ontology is an approach describing the basic constituents and elements of reality, types, categories, inherent properties, classes with their relationships, possible instances, as well as the reasoning between their relationships. So all the ontology tools such as Prodigy, they 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 describe the entities and their activities and relationships. Let's look at the interface of Prodigy. This is the interface. Here we need to shortly explain some concepts. Entities. This is an overview of the classes and the relationships we have created. Classes, um, classes means the classes under we have created. Here we have created the first class module, and it has subclasses CS module and math module. Also, the class person has a subclass lecturer and student. And object properties refers to the activities that the classes do. Like a lecturer, they need to teach, and students, they do learning. So here we describe the studies. Studies, it belongs to student. It's an activity by student, and its range student studies classes, so its range is module, and the teachers they teach classes. So the class of lecturer and the class of module is related by object properties. And the data properties refers to the properties under the classes, like first name, last name, staff ID, student ID. So like the student, they have their student ID, and also every person they have first name and the last name. All person have first name and last name, and its range is string. Individuals by class means that the individuals under this class, like under the CS module, we have two courses, CS 101 and CS 103. And under lecture, we have two lecturers, lecture 1 and lecture 2. So these are the basic concepts in Prodigy. Also, you can create more complicated relationships. And after we create this ontology, and you can output the page and upload it in FTP, upload it to FTP. Now, so this is a result of the page. Here at the head, there are some basic information, and here are the entities like object properties. Learned that they are the actions by the classes of the classes. So there are studies, teach, the studies, its domain is student, and its range is module. And under the object property teach, its domain is lecture, and its range is module. So also you can see other entities like properties, first name, last name, staff ID, and the classes and the individuals. Yeah. Now, this is a brief introduction of my artifact, the ontology page created by Prodigy. Thank you.